Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for the fourth and final day of quarterfinals action at Worlds 2023. I'm very excited to get into this. This, in my opinion, was the most interesting of all of the Round 1 series. I was talking about it in my primer video. Quick plug, if you haven't checked out that primer video, go check it out. We covered all of the quarterfinal series there, and with all of them wrapping up, it is still good to get an idea of what my expectations were for this series, but also what I expect to happen for the rest of this tournament. There's a full bracket prediction in that as well, and so check that video out. But in that video, I talk about this series being the one I was the most excited for, and one that I think is one of the most volatile in the entire tournament left, like really of all the options, and so I'm very excited for it. Let me know if you are as well down in the comment section below. Did it live up to your expectations? Were you surprised by the outcome, or did it maybe go as you expected? It's definitely going to be divisive, I think, amongst the fan base, so would love to know your thoughts down below. Quick plug, if you are new here, it really would mean a lot to me if at any point that you find yourself enjoying the video, whether that's now or in 20 minutes or whenever, if you would hit that like button. It really does help in the algorithm quite a bit, and it does let me know you guys are enjoying the content, so it really would mean a lot. Hit subscribe if you're enjoying it, but I don't want to pander to you guys too much at the beginning of videos. You know I hate doing that. I want to jump right into the content, so let's do that. If you are new here, what we do in this video is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game in the series, and at the end of the series, I'll give a player of the series to kind of tie everything up into a nice little bow. By the end of the episode, we will know all 4 teams that are going to be in the semifinals of Worlds. We won't be covering that super in-depth in today's video because we will have an entire separate video coming out previewing the semifinals and the rest of the tournament as a whole, so be on the lookout for that. But today, we get to cover our 4th and final quarterfinals matchup, which is between the number 3 seed from the LPL in LNG and the number 2 seed from the LCK in T1. It's the final remnant of the LCK here at the World Championships. The LPL has dominated up until this point. All 3 of the other teams to win in the quarterfinals are from the LPL. The last opportunity for any other region to get themselves into the top 4 is this series. And the reason that I considered it so interesting is because I really do believe that it is probably the closest matchup in the first round. I mean, maybe Weibo and Energy, but we saw that Weibo really just kind of outpaced them in that series. I would be surprised if that happened in this series, because I really do think both of these are really good teams, and that doesn't seem to be public consensus. People seem to be really out on the LCK and on T1 in general, but as highly as I think of LNG, I had T1 ranked higher going into this tournament in my primer. I had them as the number 3 team at Worlds. I had LNG as the number 4 team at Worlds going into this tournament. Now, things have definitely adjusted. LNG gets side selection for this series because they were better in the Swiss stage, only losing to JD Gaming, getting out relatively easily, a team that they've just not been able to overcome throughout the year so far. Nobody really has, quite frankly, but T1, I think, stumbled a little bit more. Definitely had some hiccups. That first game against Team Liquid is going to stand out in a lot of people's minds, but they got better as the tournament progressed. Owner, in particular, has really started to get back into form, and that is incredibly important. He was kind of the last remaining member to hold out from being back into form once Faker came back into the lineup, but in the last couple of games, the last couple of series that he played in the Swiss stage, it did look pretty good, and so that's definitely a feather in the cap of T1. If they're going to be able to keep up that level of momentum, then actually they're in a relatively good spot, and I think a lot of the praise that I gave them going into this tournament is valid. There was a reason I thought they were the better team going into this tournament, and that's because I think the consistency of what they offer is incredible. Zeus is in fantastic form. Owner's getting back into form. Faker has been one of the best mid laners in the world very quietly. We'll talk about why it might not matter in this series because of his opponent, but certainly a fun matchup there. And Guma and Keria are always going to be one of the best bot lanes in the world. But for LNG on the other side, this team might be peaking at the exact right time. This is a super team basically with a few holes, and those holes have not been able to be exploited by basically anybody over the course of this year, but Tarzan, Scout, Gala as a trio is a super team kind of trio. It's the second best trio in the world, in my opinion, only behind JD Gaming, at least in terms of raw talent. Scout has been the best player in the world in the mid lane across 2023. I know you might not consider him the strongest player in the world. I don't either. I had him in the top 5 going into this tournament, but players like Knight and, Chovy and even, someone like Bin is, you could consider to be more mechanically talented. Ruler you could consider to be higher upside, but in terms of the performances that we've gotten in 2023, I don't think there's an argument to be made that anybody has played better this year than Scout, and that includes at this tournament where he has been sensational. Even against JD Gaming, he was the reason they were able to take a game off of them in the Swiss stage, and so if Scout's going to be able to play like that, that could neutralize a lot of the advantages that Faker had over basically everybody else that he played this year. Gala has been spectacular. He has showed up at every World Championships that he has played, this one included. Tarzan seems to have gotten back on page, although he can be relatively inconsistent. That's generally the jungle role in particular in 2023, but Tarzan definitely falls into that. The question marks are going to be players like Zika and players like Hong, who are very solid, but this is really their first big test on an international stage. Are they going to be able to hold up going against a team like T1 that every single player on this team was in the finals last year? And so those are going to be the questions, but the top-end talent on LNG can go toe-to-toe with anybody in the world, and that definitely includes T1. I basically gave this a 50-50. I think in my video I said it was 55-45. Very close, and in my opinion, the closest round one series, but I gave it to LNG in terms of my preview. Is that going to come true? Well, we're going to find out right now, because of course, going game by game means we get to start with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was T1. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0 with a really strong 26-minute win. I did not see this coming. First of all, awesome draft by T1. I think they really got in the head of LNG. Obviously, we'll go a little bit more in depth when it comes to draft and why I think T1 ended up coming out on top here. I'm not necessarily blaming LNG because I think their draft, for all intents and purposes, is fine. I think it has a lot of win conditions. It scales very well. But T1 knew clearly what LNG's kind of thought process and strategy was going to be going into these games. And I don't know if that's because they've scrimmed them a lot or maybe they just have a good research team, but they had a very good game plan for going into this game number 1, and I do think they executed on it incredibly well. You don't win in 26 minutes against LNG, a team that just made the LPL finals in the summer split by accident. This was a fantastic performance, basically, from all 5 members. Let's go ahead and talk about draft really quick, because that is how we start off a lot of these segments. Like I said, I think T1 does get the advantage in draft, and I think the really big pick is the R5 Neela. I think that basically shuts down everything that LNG wants to do on the bot side of the map. In the early game, you draft the Kai'Sa Blitzcrank in order to be both a playmaking creator in the late game and also have pressure in the mid game where you can potentially try and get that Kai'Sa rolling, get the ball moving, get it, snowballing as fast as possible. And the Neela just shuts that down almost instantly. Obviously, the Senna flexed into the support position is massive. It just creates this gigantic problem that Kai'Sa really has no way of dealing with. Now, Blitz could be relatively effective in this game if he plays his cards right, but we'll talk about this. Not a very good game from Hong, and so the Blitzcrank didn't end up mattering all that much, but the Neela Senna is really what I think pushes this draft over the edge. I think Aatrox into Gwen is fine for Aatrox. We've seen that champion actually perform incredibly well. I'm getting very close to just saying that Aatrox is the best top laner in the game in the current patch, or at least in the Worlds patch, and I don't think it's that far off reality. I think a lot of teams would tell you that it's Rumble. I think for most of the tournament, would have told you it's K'Sante. I still think K'Sante is definitely in the conversation, but Aatrox has just performed better than every other top laner, even in relatively okay, theoretically okay matchups, not great matchups. Gwen is one of those, and I still think Aatrox did really well here. I think a lot of players at this tournament just play him at a high level, and Zeus had another strong game, so you have a winning top side, you have a winning bot side because of the way you draft him. I don't love picking Azir into Orianna. I think that's generally Orianna favored because of the scaling, but Azir does have a little bit more help here with potential Blitzcrank roams, and then Jarvan. I do think that could, maybe slightly put it in favor of the Azir if things start to get shaken up at least a little bit, but Ori still is going to have a lot of pressure in that lane, and she is going to scale just as well as anybody, and when you look at LNG's draft, you're looking at scaling, and so I don't really love, what ended up happening for LNG, but in theory, I think a lot of their draft moves were smart. I think B2 Kai'Sa with the Xayah band out is incredibly smart, especially pairing it up with something like Blitzcrank that can create and can, help her get online. Same thing with the Jarvan. I think Jarvan on B1 is one of the best picks in the game right now. I don't love the Azir, and the Gwen is just fine. It's not great, but everything else I think is fine for LNG. It's just T1 drafting really well, in my opinion. So now that draft is out of the way, what happened in the game? Well, Faker took over, man. He's going to get player of the game in game number 1. I do think that this is up for debate. I think a player like Owner could also get it just because of the sheer amount of engages that he was able to execute on Rel, but I'm going to be entirely honest, nothing that he did this game was particularly special. His pathing was good, which has been a problem for him over the course of the last few months. Owner's pathing has by far been the weakest part of his game, at least over the course of the summer splits, since Faker ended ended up leaving the lineup, and it was fine this game, which is definitely encouraging, but Faker was the one kind of positioning and managing a lot of the very good plays that they were making over the course of this game. Owner just was kind of capitalizing on the advantages that the rest of his team was able to get. So Faker, for me, is going to get that player of the game. The Orianna proving to still be a really strong pick. I've never denied the idea that Orianna is incredibly strong in the back half of the game, and especially in a pro environment where you can more reliably, I guess, get to that late game and kind of neutralize pressure in the early game if you have a good game plan. I think Ori does hold a ton of value. I just don't love like R1, B1 kind of value for Orianna in a meta where I don't think there are a ton of mid lane matchups that are like super Ori favored in the early game, but you can still pilot her at a high level, and Faker's obviously a very good Orianna. We've seen the benefits of that champion and the negatives, but the benefits as well over the course of this entire tournament, and I think this game is another good example of that. I do think that Owner does deserve a lot of shoutouts because Rel is an incredibly effective champion at what she does. I just think it was a little bit more of the champion and less of the player, in my opinion, in this game. Again, not to take anything away from what Owner is as a player and, you know, what he was able to do. I just don't think he had a very hard job this game. He still executed on the things he needed to do. Again, love Neela Senna in this context as a bot lane. We've seen Senna quite a bit at this tournament as an AD carry, as a bot laner, as somebody that you can plug into that role and be, you know, relatively safe in the early game, scale up really easily, potentially have something like a Tahm Kench for both protection and for, you know, just chaos in the mid to late game, especially for a team like T1 because Keria plays that Tahm Kench so well. Guma played that Senna super well earlier on in the tournament. It created this idea that that was definitely what was coming, which of course baited some picks in, the Blitzcrank in particular, on the side of LNG, but replacing that with the Neela, I think was just really, really smart from T1, and this is the kind of, you know, draft manipulation that top teams in the world are able to do. I know teams like T1 end up getting a lot of flack for their drafts. T1 in particular has just been berated for their drafts over the past couple of years, but I think this team is just as good as anybody else in the world at being able to get their players in a position that they are the most comfortable on. It might not always read that way to Reddit because Reddit doesn't always have the best idea of what a good draft looks like, but this was really smart in my opinion. And then Zeus was solid on the top side as well. Like I said, Aatrox has just kind of been able to win over the course of this tournament, and Zeus is certainly a top tier Aatrox. And so generally for T1, this was a great game one. They kind of decimated a very good LNG team, and for LNG, you got to get back to the drawing board. A couple of your players really underperformed, made a lot of moments that were very head-scratching and very questionable, put their team behind by a considerable amount in both the early and the late game. I guess I'll talk about them first. Dud of the game for me could go to two players. I'm going to give it to Hong. I think a lot of people are going to want to see Tarzan get this for Jarvan. I think both of them were absolutely horrendous in game number one. It was very difficult to decide who ended up being worse in the first game of this series. I ended up going with Hong because I think really, when you boil it down, like, Tarzan at least, like, tried to do something. Hong made 2 plays the entire game, and both of them almost single-handedly lost the game for LNG. He basically landed 2 hooks, one around the 18-minute mark that ended up getting his own AD carry killed, and then one in the back half of the game that literally ended the game. Like, you can't pull the Aatrox in into your entire team. Like, I don't know what's going on. Your AD carry, Gala is probably like, what the hell is going on? But Hong just completely AFK ran it this game. If my Blitzcrank played like this, I would lose my mind. There wasn't a hook hit before 15 to 18 minutes into the game, and that is a disaster if you are that champion. But again, you could also theoretically give this to Tarzan on the Jarvan. Jarvan is one of those B1 worthy types of champions that can both set up and scale into the late game. Very good for the team fight stage. Does have a lot of pressure in terms of ganks and skirmishes in the early game. Just gives you a little bit of everything that you could want in this meta. Definitely pairs up with a lot of the other meta mid laners or bot laners or, you know, etc, etc. The problem is Tarzan just ran it this game. This is one of the worst Jarvan games at the tournament. It is very rare to see a Jarvan lose pressure so early. I know Rel is one of those champions that does want to get the snowball rolling early, does want to try to get some gold under her belt so that when she does engage, it doesn't just end with her dying instantly, but Tarzan needed to be better. Like, he had to be faster, and he just wasn't. This was one of the bad Tarzan games. I talked about him being relatively volatile in my intro speech here. This was one of the negatives. A lot of people like to rag on Tarzan, and I've been a Tarzan defender over the course of this year. I'm absolutely still a Tarzan defender. He still puts out some of the best performing games in the world right now when he is on, but he's not immune to bad games, and I'm not going to sit here and lie to you just because the narrative I've been pitching over the course of this year is that Tarzan isn't nearly as bad as people think he is. I still believe Tarzan is still a major asset to this team. Also, while having a really bad game one here, I think both of those things can be true, but Zika, Scout, Gala, they were fine, I guess. Scout kind of got run over in the mid lane matchup. Faker dominated him in terms of the lane, but again, that's kind of to be expected if you just leave Orianna alone into the Azir. Azir needs scaling after the early game nerfs, and he just never was able to get it this game. Zika was fine, I guess, on the Gwen, tried to get a couple of shutdown kills, but most of that was garbage time. Gala couldn't really do anything when his support was running it, so this is kind of a bad game for LNG and certainly concerning. They do not want to go down 0-2 against T1. That would be a pretty big disaster circumstance, and for T1, if you're able to go up 2-0 into LNG to control that series, we've seen the kind of power that can hold, and especially for a team that's basically carrying the entire weight of a nation on their back right now, that would be a huge relief off their shoulders, I think. And so, big game number 2 here, but who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was T1. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and that's a commanding place to be in full control of the series with 2 wins. 1 win away from moving on to the semifinals is a really nice place to be, and I hate to say it, but it just does not feel like LNG has shown up here today. T1 has controlled every aspect of this series so far, and even in this game number 2, which I guess theoretically was closer than game number 1, LNG still never really felt like they had a shot to be able to win it, like they were in it at all. There were a couple of plays that I think were fine, a couple of players that I think were fine on LNG, but really it's T1 controlling the pacing of the game. They're controlling the pacing of the series. Their macro has been impeccable, and LNG just seems to be falling behind in every single aspect, and that starts at draft. It's not like this is just in the game. It's every aspect of the game that feels like T1 is just clicking on all cylinders right now. So let's go ahead and talk about it, because genuinely, I think this game was really, really interesting to kind of try and analyze, because T1 is not playing the way that they have in recent months, in recent weeks. It's not been the macro that's really separated T1 from a lot of their opponents. Now, that being said, in the regular season, it kind of was, but by the time we got to the playoffs and, you know, what kind of let them go on their finals run was a lot of early game leads that they were able to transition into snowball victories. That's kind of really what got T1 to this point. It was something that they did really well in the LCK playoffs. It hadn't necessarily been like that at Worlds. It wasn't necessarily macro, just good late game team fighting that ended up getting them their spot here in the quarterfinals. But when you think back to the spring split, when this team was like at its absolute best, they were controlling the game with early macro, they were snowballing quickly, but they were doing it through really smart draft picks and really creative uses of, I guess, man advantages, you know, support ganks and, you know, things like top lane roams. They were really good at that in spring, and they kind of moved away from that style. It seems they're getting back to that here in the quarterfinals, and I find that to be probably the most interesting outcome possible for T1. So let's go ahead and talk about it. This draft in general is going to remind a lot of people of spring T1, not only because of, you know, a couple of the picks are like the Sylas or the Aatrox, but of course the Ashe in the support position, the marksman support that really defined T1's spring split here, that defined Carrier's MVP run in the spring split. For them to get back to this now, I think it's a pretty intriguing time. We saw the Senna in game number 1 go into the support position, which I think was definitely kind of a prelude to this, but that's something that I think makes a lot more sense in the current meta. Ashe is also something that can be viable as a support even outside of just this like lane dominant role. It's something that you will see pretty commonly as a counter to things like Kalista if you want to pull that out, but to play it into something like Aphelios Rakan is certainly risky. I'm not going to sit here and say that it's a great decision, but LNG was clearly not ready for it, because the domination that this bot lane showed early on in the laning phase was astronomical. I want to give a lot of credit to Gala, because I think he did a really good job of maintaining his side of the matchup, knowing that he just has to scale into the late game, because Aphelios, quite frankly, is just going to be stronger than both of the marksmen that you're going into by the time this game gets out of control, and blue side in general scales really hard, but T1 has so much pressure in the early game, and they apply so much so quickly that the game just got too far out of control to wait for Aphelios, Maokai, Gwen, who are really strong in terms of the scaling matchup, to get online. That's why I don't think it's quite as big of a draft gap, in my opinion, as game number 1, because you do have that scaling option with the Aphelios and the Gwen. In particular, obviously, Maokai would theoretically help, but one of the picks that really solidifies this as a very good draft for T1, in my opinion, is the Sylas in the mid lane. I've been very high on this pick over the course of this entire tournament. I'm not going to stop now when you get to pick it into both Jace and Maokai, a matchup that Sylas wins incredibly hard. This is a very risky early draft plan from LNG that they got away with a lot in the LPL. A lot of LPL teams played Maokai Jace like religiously. That was the #1 played mid-jungle duo in the LPL by a ginormous margin, and it's not hard to see why. Obviously, those two champions have a ton of synergy together, and they apply a lot of pressure in the mid-game, which I think is probably the most important part of the game in the meta. The problem is they both really hard lose to Sylas. Sylas shuts down Jace in the early game, the part that Jace needs to dominate. He does a really good job of getting into his face and making sure that he can't really be that aggressive force that moves around the map. It made Scout's life a lot more difficult, which we will talk about, but obviously, the counter pick of Sylas into Maokai is very well documented because Maokai's basically an ultimate in the late game. Obviously, he's a good frontliner, and he can deal a decent amount of damage, but really what you're picking Maokai for is that zone control that you get from the ultimate in a lot of those fights, and Sylas matches that and is just more valuable in the team fight than Maokai is on top of that. He's basically a better version of him by the time you hit the late game, and if Sylas is also going to be strong early, I think this R3 pick really did set T1 up to be really strong in this game. I think Aatrox is solid here. The Rel unlocks so much for what this T1 comp wants to do. In general, I just think it's a very good draft from T1, and that's 2 in a row. It's a great understanding of what got them here in the first place, what their players are really good at, and a good idea of how to execute on game plans that LNG is kind of very commonly used over the course of this year. But even saying that, you still have to execute on them. The one flaw in this T1 game plan is the fact that, quite frankly, they don't team fight particularly well. If you're hitting the late game relatively even as this T1 team, it's kind of doomed. You have no answer to Aphelios, and even more pressing, you have no answer to Gwen the later this game goes. And so you do need to win early. You do need to kind of win fast. Luckily for this team, they were able to do that. And a lot of that is, again, because of the jungle prio that they were able to generate. Owner is going to get player of the game in Game 2. In Game 1, I talked about how it was a little bit more of the champion and less of the player, at least in my opinion, to see the success that the Rel had. In Game 2, I find it completely opposite. Not that the champion isn't incredibly valuable here, but Rel does have her shortcomings. She's not exactly this free champion in the mid game if you weren't able to generate a lot of prio in the early game. Now, Faker winning mid and being able to roam to a lot of these plays does help a lot, but Owner played fantastic in this game, and if Owner's going to continue to path very aggressively and put himself in positions where these 3v3 skirmishes are almost always going to be in T1's favor in the mid game, then all of a sudden these games become significantly more free. This was T1's problem, not only in the main Swiss stage here, but in the LCK playoffs and in the back half of the LCK regular season, was that Owner was just way too passive in the early game. His pathing was very, I don't want to say illogical, but he was very much always in the wrong position. Whether that's his fault or the team's fault, I'm not going to sit here and just blame Owner, but Owner's, effect on the team was not positive, right? Where he was on the team was not helping the team, whether it was his call or not. But it does seem like a lot of those issues have been kind of fixed up. It feels like they have a lot better of a game plan going into Worlds, and he's been fantastic in the last, 6 or 7 games that this team has played. He's been one of the best junglers that we've seen at the tournament in that time frame, and that's really good to see because he was struggling in the first couple of games, and so really happy to see Owner have a really nice game. But obviously, Zeus continues to look awesome on the Aatrox. It's almost becoming something that you have to ban out against this team. He's just dominating Zika in the top lane. We talked about the weak links, quote-unquote, for LNG, the non-super team parts of LNG potentially being a hindrance, and Zika has just not been able to hold up against Zeus in this series at all. It's been a pretty big top gap, and it's not super mattered towards the outcome because everything else has also gone the way of T1, but these are flaws that I think would be a problem in almost any other circumstance. Like, Zeus is absolutely gapping Zika, and it's not particularly close. Faker is absolutely gapping Scout. Obviously, the big narrative about the former T1, the former SKT mid laners going head-to-head here, especially with Scout having the best year of his entire career. Faker, trying to reclaim that form here in Korea, being the last vestige of Korean hope at Worlds. For Faker to just come out and kind of dominate him 2 games in a row here, it's certainly something, and we'll talk about that. But obviously, Varus and Ashe, very strong bot lane, and they did a good job early. Like I said, credit to Gala for surviving because I do think he was by far the best member of LNG this game. A lot of people are going to criticize him for just AFK farming, but what else are you supposed to do in this lane? You really don't have any easy ways to get in, and especially as Aphelios, if the rest of your team is losing and doesn't have easy avenues, then it's just over. There's really not a lot you can do in that circumstance. So, credit to T1. They did everything that they were supposed to do, but for LNG, it's disaster mode. You're 1 game away from being eliminated from Worlds, and quite frankly, your players are just not playing up to the task. It doesn't feel like they were particularly ready. They're pulling out a lot of the things that they are the most predictable on, and it's not working. T1 has answers to it, and it doesn't feel like they're adapting all that well right now. Dead of the game is going to go to Scout in the mid lane. I love Scout. He's been phenomenal over the course of this year, but he's been gapped twice in this series. Yes, I do think the Sylas really threw off a lot of the game plan that LNG had in this one, but Scout simply has to be better. The Jace is important towards what this team wants to do, and the Jace is one of the picks that got Scout on the map this year in the first place. It really was one of the most dominant things that he had in his arsenal, and he got wrecked on it in this game, which is concerning, to say the least. If Faker's just straight up going to be better than him, they play so much through Scout's prio in the mid lane. If he loses it, this team loses a lot of the advantages that they have in the mid game, and a lot of their ability to, quite frankly, win a game in general comes from Scout's advantages. Now, Tarzan's been playing a little bit too slow. Maokai, I think, is generally a fine pick, but maybe not B1 anymore, right? You have other options. If you don't feel comfortable on the Jarvan, maybe save jungle for later in the draft, because it's just not going to work out if you pick something as slow as Maokai. T1 have shown that they're going to beat you if they go early game. And then Zeke is getting outclassed. Hung is doing absolutely nothing. It's been a brutal series for him. Gall has been by far the best player on LNG and really the only one who's even kind of surviving the onslaught that T1 is putting on. But it's not like he can really do anything. It's not like him playing well is going to change the fortunes of what this team is capable of doing. This is a disastrous game number 2 from LNG. They're now down 0-2. One more game and they are eliminated. If they can't take a single game off of T1, I think a lot of people are going to consider that a disappointing outcome. But obviously the series is not yet over. T1 has shown a lot of their cards, but LNG now has the ability to react and counter punch if they go for something like double marksman bot. There are ways to be able to beat that. LNG just have to be willing to go towards them. So are they going to be able to do that, or is T1 going to walk here to a pretty casual 3-0 sweep? Well, the winner of game number 3 was T1. They are going to win game number 3. They're going to take this series in a clean 3-0 sweep, and wow, the utter domination of T1 in this series. I was talking about this being the series I was most anticipating going into round number 1, how I thought it was going to be the closest it got. My closest spread of 55-45 of any single series in round number 1. And what we are left with is the most lopsided series that we got in round number 1. A clean 3-0, but not just a clean 3-0, a dominant 3-0. All 3 games being absolutely massacred by T1 on red side, mind you, which a lot of people right now consider to be the weaker side. And obviously, statistics do back that up. I do think it's a little bit inflated, as I've talked about on this channel, because you know, all the good teams got blue side and side selection in the Swiss stage because of the format, but still, for T1 to dominate this series in the way that they were able to, it's crazy impressive, and it really does show that they are one of the best teams in the world, period. End of story. I was talking about how I wanted this matchup on the top side of the bracket, and I want it even more now on the top side of the bracket because T1, yes, they're moving on into the semifinals, which is obviously great, but they're going to have to do it against what I consider to be the best team in the world right now, where, you know, the other side's a little bit easier to deal with, and so definitely going to be fun, but we could be getting a World Finals matchup in the semifinals. But let's talk about game number 3 before we get too deep into the rest of this tournament. Game number 3 was still something worth talking about because T1 continues to perform the things that they do really well at a very high level, and LNG just had no answers. We talked about how T1 played really well and how they're moving on. LNG is now officially eliminated from Worlds 2023. They are done in the 2023 season. This super team did not work out. They did not do what I think they wanted to do, which was probably at the very least get to the semifinals, be a top 4 team in the world. And quite frankly, they should have been. They just weren't able to get the job done here. They underperformed a ton when it really mattered the most. I think there's going to be a lot of blame thrown around on a couple of players, but let's be entirely honest here. Nobody on this team played good enough today. Nobody was good enough for this team to win. We can sit here and point fingers at 1 or 2 or 3 players, but all 5 of them have to take some responsibility. The coaching staff has to take some responsibility for getting draft gapped in every single game, for not being prepared for what T1 has to offer, especially in this game number 3, where this is a much more standard T1 comp, something that they played a ton of in spring and in the Swiss stage. It just felt like LNG had no answers. It really was disappointing to see how this team ended up going out, but let's go ahead and talk about it, of course, starting with that draft gap that I keep talking about. T1 obviously doing a great job on red side to capitalize on the fact that they get counter picks in a lot of key roles. I think a lot of teams have prioritized getting the strong picks in the meta. Things like Jarvan and Orianna have been very common first picks, but I've talked about how I really don't see them as uncounterable. Jarvan maybe a little bit less so. He is definitely very strong right now, but LNG felt like they could ban him out this entire series because they didn't want Tarzan playing him because he clearly wasn't good at him on game number 1. They wanted him on something that could be a little bit more consistent as a facilitator, and so they go for the Orianna on B1 once again in this game. And I've talked ad nauseum in this series, you know, at Worlds so far about just why I don't like B1 Orianna nearly as much as these teams. I'm not trying to sit here and say, and I like to clarify this in every video, Orianna is by far the best late game mid laner in the game right now. Her team fighting is basically unmatched in terms of what her mid lane offers. And I think that is why we see a lot of Azir as the answer to her right now at Worlds, is because Azir is one of the few champions that can be relatively similar in the late game, but I think it's the wrong approach. I've talked about that over this tournament, is I think taking Azir is the wrong mentality. I would take something like a Sylas or an Akali, as we've seen over this tournament. You know, there have been a couple of picks that I think have really been positive for me that have just been able to beat the Orianna early, and that's really where I think you're going to get a majority of your advantages. You know, the Azir has been the kind of easy answer that I think a lot of teams have just kind of defaulted to, but it's not one that I would prefer. Either way, it still is relatively scaling versus scaling, and if you have a good jungle matchup, which T1 does, in this game, it can still be Azir favored, especially if he does get online. But really where this draft starts to pick up is the idea for going for aggressive bot and top lanes, going for early game again. But I think unlike game number 2, where you really had this big early game advantage and your team falls off really hard in the late game, you scale significantly better here in game number 3. Obviously, Azir is going to be a problem, but Varus is going to be a problem in the late game. Poppy can still do a lot of interesting things, specifically into champions like Sejuani or Renekton. You have a lot of opportunities to be a little bit more positive in this game about, you know, letting things go later. They didn't let things go later. They still dominated the early game and they snowballed the game out of control, which they should with this draft. You have 3 winning lanes, but it's worth noting that I think this is even better than their game 2 draft. I would argue that this is their best draft of the series, which is very impressive considering what they did in the first 2 games. And so really great stuff, but of course the Jace ends up being a massive pick. R5 Jace in the top lane was not something that I think LNG was expecting. Zeus is going to get player of the game, and maybe surprisingly is also going to get my player of the series. Zeus has returned to what we all kind of hoped he would develop into, which is arguably the best top laner in the world. I think if Bin didn't exist, this would be a very easy award to give over to Zeus. Because think about top laners last year. Think about how negative we were speaking about the position. It very much was like, oh, Zeus is the best top laner, 369 is really good, and everybody else just kind of meh, right? There's just not a lot of competition for being really good top lane, and even Zeus and 369 were showing some of their flaws in 2022, but both of them have taken major step-ups. We've had Bin, we had Keen have a career year up until Worlds. Like, there's just been a ridiculous amount of, like, surge in talent in the top lane, and Zeus is a big part of that. In most years, Zeus would be considered easily the best top laner in the world for how he's performing, for how much the team has relied on him. He's arguably been the best player on T1 over the past 2 months, and that's hard to do. Faker's been awesome. Carry has been really good. Gumayushi has been very good. But I think Zeus has been the big, like, difference maker for this team. He was easily their best player in the playoffs, domestically in the LCK. He was awesome in the Swiss stage, and he has dominated Zika in this series. I think, you know, player of the series, I think on broadcast went to Owner. And trust me, I get it. He deserves it too. That's the right choice. But Zeus is also the right choice. You know what I mean? They're both so good, and they both played so well in this series. Zeus just mega gabbed Zika, and I wanted to give him credit. And he was easily the player of the game here in game number 3. That is without a doubt, in my opinion. But Owner was also really good. I think Poppy is still a very strong pick. We saw it banned out a ton at the beginning of the tournament, specifically in the play-in stage. It's really fallen off in terms of presence, in terms of what the teams have been willing to invest into it, but I think it's just as strong, and I think a lot of teams should start to prioritize it a bit more. Every single time we see it, it impacts the game very heavily. This isn't even a great Poppy game in terms of what you're going into in comparison to some of the other comps and, you know, teams that, you know, other rosters are going to build, right? Other teams are going to draft, but it's still good enough to make Poppy feel like such a big impact on the game, and that's really the difference. Zeus and Owner were massive. Faker was really good in this series. He was a big difference maker. He just gapped Scout in lane in all 3 games, even in some matchups that weren't phenomenal. Well, it's really just this game in a matchup that wasn't perfect, but even then, it's not like Azir can't do anything into Orianna. He's just not well equipped to kind of demolish her in the same way that some of the other mid laners are, but Azir's still really strong, and Faker's obviously great at the champ. Faker was phenomenal in this series. Guma and Keria pulling out some weird picks and being solid. They were probably weak side and, you know, the quote-unquote less attractive part of the team over the course of this series, but if that's the case with how these two played, that's insane, because Keria was phenomenal. But for T1, they just are clicking on all cylinders. This was a demolition. It doesn't get easier from here. That's absolutely true, but if they're going to play like this, I mean, quite frankly, they could be the best team in the world. This was a best team in the world caliber performance. And then for LNG on the other side, what happened, man? I mean, I hate to kick a team while they're down, and anybody who follows the channel knows I much prefer to be positive about everybody's year. I've been positive about everybody who has been eliminated from the tournament. Even a team like Gen.G that I think had much higher expectations than going out in the quarterfinals. It's really hard for me not to be positive because of just the sheer amount of good things that a lot of these teams that have gotten here have done over the course of this year. But for LNG, it just is such a sour note, man. Like, it is not good. Tarzan was miserable in this series. He's going to get the dud of the series and the dud of the game and yada yada. He was just out-jungled in every part. Zika was almost Flame Horizoned in like 20 minutes in game number 2. Was absolutely destroyed by Zeus in every single game. Scout put up absolutely no resistance. What has been the best performing player in the world looked like a schmuck going up against Faker, quite frankly, in this series. And trust me, if you follow the series, you know this already. If you follow the channel, you know this already. I'm not one who goes to hyperbole. I'm not one who's like, oh, this person was awful in this series and they suck because of this. Like, I very much like to push back on those narratives. That's something that I very much try to be, you know, not the version of, because you see that everywhere. You see it on Reddit, you see it on Twitter, you see it in other analysts, other streamers, and, you know, I try to offer a different perspective, but there's just nothing else to say about LNG other than they sucked today. Like, they didn't put up any sort of fight. They drafted poorly, they played poorly, their laning was bad, their macro was bad, their decisions were bad, their positioning was bad. It was just awful. Like, there was no redeeming factor. Gala looked okay, I guess, but Hong was completely outclassed. Scout was completely outclassed. Tarzan was completely outclassed. Zika was completely outclassed. It's just disappointing. I think a lot of these players are going to be moving to different places if the offseason, you know, is to be believed. I don't think we're going to be seeing a run back from this LNG team. I think they were capable of a lot more. I was really interested to see if this team could take the momentum that they generated in the summer split, being able to take a game off of Gen.G in the Swiss stage, be able to translate that into something a little bit more interesting, but it just wasn't the case. They're going to go out here in quarterfinals and they're going to feel pretty bad about that. Hopefully some of these players can get themselves together and get back. For whatever reason, it just didn't end up working out here today, but I think this is a series that a lot of these players are going to regret for a little while. But for T1, you know, congratulations to them. They're moving on to face JD Gaming. Like I said, it definitely does not get easier to play the best team in the world right now, the team that's going for the Golden Road. But if anybody's going to be able to shut that narrative, shut that dream down, it's the hometown kids in T1 that hold the weight of an entire nation on their back right now. All right, but that is going to do it for day 4 of the quarterfinals, the overview and analysis of the T1 LNG series, and that's going to do it for the quarterfinals analysis. We know our 4 teams that are going to be moving on to the semifinals now. Billy taking on Weibo Gaming on the top side, JD Gaming taking on T1 on the bottom side. Very excited to cover those, but like I said, there's going to be a video later on this week that goes over those matchups in depth, that talks about my expectations, lane by lane analysis, and, you know, what you can expect from those matchups and potentially what you could expect from every possible finals matchup as well. If you're interested in that, hit the subscribe button because that will be posted in the next couple of days. I promise if you enjoyed this video, you're probably going to enjoy that one as well. Of course, we're also going to be posting some off-season content once this tournament is over. There are so many things coming to light right now in terms of the rosters that we are going to get in 2024, specifically in a lot of the Western regions, the LCS, the LEC. You know, we're starting to get a really good idea of what those teams are going to look like. If you want some analysis on what I think of those changes, hit subscribe as well so you can be there for when the off-season does kick off. Of course, if you did enjoy this video, I really would appreciate it if you left a like on it. We put a lot of time and effort into not only watching these games here and making these videos, but watching everything over the course of this year. We watched all 4 major regions, which does give us, you know, hopefully a little bit of an upper leg in terms of the analysis we can give you for these games here. So if you enjoyed it, it really would mean a lot if you hit that like button. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all